or do we want to give it another minute?
Yeah. No, we can get started. I just started the recording, so if there's anything that folks want to review after this meeting, you'll have access to it. And then also for fellows who weren't able to join us today, they have access to all the information too. So yeah, we can get started.
Okay, great. So candidate education. So this sort of outlines why it's a little bit different. We're not doing any kind of direct policy support ask. Most candidates are going to be completely unfamiliar. They don't know anything about any of our issues. Maybe you've got a few that know a little bit about one or two, but they certainly don't know generally what's been going on the policy front with most of these things. And you really just want to give them a general overview about why the environment is important and how it connects to human health, since that's sort of the angle we look at all of these environmental issues through. So really it's just to sort of give them a little bit of education, gauge how receptive they are, but the most important thing is just to establish some sort of rapport relationship with the candidate so that they can think of you as a resource, assuming they get elected, when they're facing 8,000 people coming at them every day with various issues. You want them to think, wait, this is an environmental issue. This is something that impacts health. I should talk to the Ecology Center folks. And so that's really the main goal. Half of the meeting at least is going to be about listening. They want to talk about themselves, ask them about what their issue priorities are, why they're running. And then, if you can, you want to try to make a connection between our issues and their priorities. Good example, you'll get a lot of people who say they're running on issues around education. There are easy connections to education with some of our talking points that we're going to go over. Obviously, lead has a significant impact on education. All of the problems associated with lead exposure, learning disabilities. And so you want to talk about if you're focused on, if they're focused on education, you can try to make that connection to why it's important. On some of the energy issues, we're going to talk about energy poverty and some of the things that need to be done, especially with COVID going on. One of the things we're asking for is a complete moratorium on utility shutoffs as long as this pandemic is ongoing. And that obviously relates to education because people can't do distance learning if they don't have access to electricity and internet. We can switch to the next slide. So this is just sort of an overview of how the candidate meeting will go. It's not an exact science because you really want to make sure that you're taking cues from the candidate and let the conversation flow. Like I said, it's mostly about building rapport and less about trying to get through all of your exact points. But when you start the meeting, we'll do an introduction, give your name, a little bit about yourself, and why you wanted to meet, why these issues are important to you. Let the candidate introduce themselves, let them tell you a little bit about why they're running. They will generally offer that information immediately. Like I said, they like to talk about themselves. They want you to know that that they are worth your support. But if they don't immediately offer, it's fine to ask. Say, what made you run? Or, what are your top priorities? Why are you running? It's perfectly legitimate, and that will generally get them talking. And often, they won't stop, and the meeting will go for 30 minutes, and they will keep talking. So you want to try and still get in your points, but definitely it's worth spending some time listening and letting them talk about their priorities. Provide a little bit of background about the issues you want to talk about. So really, we talk about the connection between the environment and human health. And again, if you can reiterate, your work as a health professional and why these issues matter. And then you can get into the talking points and the policy priorities. Like I said, we're giving you the top line. We don't want to try to get into a whole lot of detail right now, and they're not going to have the time. So just want to give them an overview of sort of what we're looking at in the next legislative session. Really good to acknowledge, this goes to building rapport and becoming a resource to them, acknowledging sort of that when they get elected, and you always want to say when you get elected because you don't want to give them an if. It's always good to encourage them, even if you know that that's not going to happen. So when you get elected, we know that you are going to be faced with people, demanding your time constantly, coming at you with this huge barrage of issues, and we want to make sure that you can call upon us if you need help, or if you need more information about different issues, or if you have questions about these environmental health issues. It's good to just acknowledge that they are going to be stressed, and that they are not going to have time to read everything from every organization that wants their attention. And so again, just you're there as somebody that they can reach out to. That should pretty much take us through the entire, generally half-hour meeting. Sometimes they last longer, but usually they're about half an hour. I think via Zoom, it's probably going to be more limited to half an hour. If you're meeting over coffee, sometimes it gets extended depending on if you have this great rapport with them. But I think just by virtue of the situation, doing all of this via Zoom, it probably will be pretty limited to half an hour. Thank them for your time, for their time. Offer them your contact information. If you're willing to share your cell phone, that's great. We will share ours. One of the big goals is if we can get their cell phone information, if they're willing to share it with us, that's great, because it's helpful during the legislative session when something big comes up. I'm very careful about how often I use a cell phone, but if I have it, then if something is happening very quickly, or something is happening on the floor, then we can text to them, say, hey, this is happening, or this amendment looks bad. It gives us the ability to respond more quickly if we have a cell phone number. If they have a staffer with them, because sometimes they will have a staffer join, get their contact information as well. Often campaign staff now will become legislative staff later. And then just reiterate your willingness to serve as a resource. Really just listening is the key point, building the relationship, most important thing. And do not worry if you don't get through all of the talking points. You don't have to, and I expect on these short timetables that you probably won't. So that's really the basics of how to do a candidate ed meeting. And so we can move now into some of the top line talking points. And for candidate education, obviously there are so many issues we work on, but we're just going to give you three major issues that we figure are going to come up in the next year or the next legislative session that we're going to be prioritizing. There's some energy policy points, lead policy points, and PFAS policy points. Next. So I'm going to go over the climate and energy points, and then Mara is going to go over the lead and PFAS with you. So this page really is the more general of the talking points. Energy waste reduction standard, and I know that in some of the earlier webinars we talked about energy efficiency and energy waste reduction. They are the same thing, so sometimes you'll hear them interchangeably. The reason we're using energy waste reduction in the talking points is because that is actually what it was renamed to within the legislation last time it was passed in 2018. That energy waste reduction standard is set to sunset in 2021. So the big, broad climate and energy talking point is renew and increase the energy waste reduction standard so that it stays in place after the 2021 sunset. We need it to be extended long-term. What we found is that utilities, if they don't have the requirements on them, they don't do it. We've also added in, talk about equitable spending requirements for low-income households. What that means is, right now, under the energy waste reduction standard, they have to spend certain or reduce energy waste in all sectors. We want to make sure that low-income homes actually get their fair share. So that's a pretty simple way of putting it. Establish a strong renewable energy standard and eliminate barriers for distributed generation. That's the rooftop solar. So we just want to make sure that more renewables are included in the energy law and make sure that people have the option to, put solar on the roof as we go forward. Public transportation is another big one. It's likely that in the next session, something will come up about regional transit again. We just want to make sure that they are committed to investing in public transportation, and then that will ultimately be a push not only for money, but also for whatever the counties decide the legislation needs to be in order to actually move regional transit forward. And then advance electrification in the transportation sector. As we talked about early on in the program, transportation is now responsible for well over a third of carbon emissions. Electrification will help take care of that. So two things within that talking point are just expanding electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Charging infrastructure needs to be available in order to get widespread adoption of electric vehicles, and then eliminate registration fees that discourage EV purchases. Like I said, we're not going to get into a lot of detail on it, but just so you know, right now there's an excessive registration fee on all EVs and hybrids, which means that people, it was done to help offset the gas tax. But what happens is basically, gas tax is paid over time and registration fee is all up front. And so we want to make sure that it's, there aren't really penalties for owning an electric vehicle or hybrid. So those are sort of the broad-based climate and energy talking points. And then go to the next page. And these are more specific on sort of the energy and equity issues. So just increasing investment in energy assistance and low-income energy waste reduction programs for both single and multifamily homes. Create a fund, this is the biggest one, is create a fund within the Department of Health and Human Services, should be DHHS, sorry, to address health and safety issues in low-income households. That's one of our top priorities on the energy equity side. It's basically the request to create a fund that would allow things like roof fixes and pest control and dealing with knob and tube wiring, things that are happening in households that basically stop energy waste reduction measures from being accomplished. And so we're trying to work to get some more funding into that program. Banning energy and water shutoffs during the duration of the COVID emergency. Obviously, that's pretty self-explanatory. Again, you'll get a lot of people saying education is their top reason. Make that connection for them. Because as soon as they start thinking about it in terms of how these issues impact the issues that they care about, you're going to be a lot more effective. Develop income-based utility rates and payment plans that serve all Michigan residents, regardless of their energy provider. Basically, right now, it's just regulated utilities who are under the governance of the Public Service Commission. We want income-based utility rates across the board. People need to be able to afford their energy bills. and then create minimum standards for utility payment plans based on actual ability to pay. This is also coming out of some of the COVID issues. Even with moratoriums, and so far they've only been voluntary on the part of the utilities, but even with them, people are still building up arrearages over time. So at the end of these moratoriums, you're going to have people who have massive bills that they just can't pay back, and you're going to be facing mass shutoffs. And this really, and the COVID crisis and the climate crisis are obviously not over. And so, what we want is some sort of standard for repayment so that people aren't shut off. And those are all of the climate and energy top lines. I think a critical thing is like I said, you're not going to get to everything. Pick a couple things that you think you can talk about easily. Give a little bit of the connection to your work, and I think we'll be in pretty good shape.
Cool, thanks Alexis. So, like Alexis mentioned, the other two issue areas that we'll be focusing on when it comes to candidate education are around PFAS and then lead poisoning. So a quick overview of the lead poisoning specific asks. The top one, and I would say one of the main ones that the Ecology Center and then a lot of our partners who are working on preventing lead poisoning throughout the state and the region is universal testing for all children at 1 and 2 years of age. There's already been some pilot programs that have taken place throughout the state. So this might be something that you'll get questions about, but the big take-home piece of this is if we're testing children, we know who is being exposed, we can prevent further exposure. Or it can also be beneficial to know if one child has been exposed to be able to remove whatever lead contamination there is to ensure that other children aren't exposed as well. The other two that I want to talk about on this list are kind of intertwined with each other, and that has to do when it comes to housing. So the first is shifting the burden of proof to landlords. So that's talking specifically about rental housing. So helping to put in safeguards for families that are living as in rental housing. So specifically around that, it's requiring submission of documentation proving that the rental home has been made lead safe after there has already been a lead poisoning case in the actual rental property, and then requiring lead risks to be fixed or disclosed in the unit. So if there is lead to be found, that it's fixed, or at least that there's a disclosure, and that way whoever the tenant is knows about it. And then the other has to do with the sale or transfer of property, and that's just to require a risk assessment at that time. And that's just to ensure, again, if there are any sort of lead hazards or risks, that whoever is going to be living there knows about them. Really just ensuring that people understand what's going on. Also on lead poisoning, this is more on the other side, so that's specifically things we want to see to ensure prevention in homes. The other two, the first one has to do, oh, sorry, I think someone might have taken, is anyone else getting an echo? Yeah. Let me take a look, because that is not fun. All right, how about now? Cool, okay, great. Sorry about that, everybody. So the first has to do with aligning with the Childhood Lead Exposure Elimination Commission. And so that really has to do with the fact that there was a commission that was started back when Governor Snyder was still in office to work to eliminate lead exposure in Michigan. And a lot of goals and actions were put out by the commission in their annual report in 2018. We want to see alignment with the commission and ensuring that the goals and actions that they've laid out are being taken forward. This is for a couple of different reasons. One, it's we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The commission has already put together, and now I have apparently been sitting in the same spot for too long. So the commission has already put together a list of different priorities and actions. So part of it is that since we already have this legislators don't have to come in and reinvent the wheel. In the past, there's been other committees or commissions being discussed, being created, and we're saying there's already one that's in place. We have experts that are participating in it. We should be really pushing forward the goals and actions that they've already laid out. And then the other has to do with funding. So this is ensuring that requests for lead abatement through Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and the Lead Commission are funded. So it's great to have ideas and plans, but it's really important to ensure that we're funding these budget requests so that needs are actually being met. So those are the lead poisoning main talking points. And then the other is PFAS. So I have only met with one candidate so far. However, I've been getting a lot of questions around PFAS, and I've been hearing that this is an issue that candidates have questions about from other folks who've been meeting with candidates so far. So when it comes to PFAS, I'm kind of putting it into two buckets when it comes to policy priorities. The first one is turning off the tap. And when I say that, I'm just talking about preventing more PFAS from being put into our waterways, ending up in our groundwater, being used when it comes to products. So the first talking point is really about prevention and not just treatment. So that has to do with banning the use of PFAS in products. So we're focusing primarily right now on firefighting foams and then food contact materials. And this is for two reasons. One being that there are already safer alternatives in use, and that these are things that have been getting some traction already here in Michigan. So earlier this summer, a couple of firefighting foam related bills actually passed. So we do have a take back program that's been put in statute here in the state of Michigan around PFAS firefighting foam. If fire departments have it, they can actually have it removed, and then it is stored properly to ensure that the PFAS isn't going to leak into the environment. Around food contact materials, we're talking primarily around like the wrappers that are used when it comes to food products. A couple of other states have already passed legislation around this, and here in Michigan, Senator Irwin had introduced a package of bills around food packaging just last month. So these are things that are already starting to happen, and we know that there are already alternatives in place, which makes it a really easy fix or easier fix than if it was a problem that didn't have any safer alternatives. And then to go along with turning off the tap, ensuring state purchasing eliminates the purchase of PFAS-containing products when there are already safer alternatives in the market. This is something that Becca's been working a lot with local city governments around within their departments. And so the big thing is that there are a lot of alternatives when it comes to different products that don't contain PFAS. So a great way to prevent PFAS exposure is ensuring that we're not using products that contain it. And then lastly, around PFAS, two things that really have to do with funding, and it's more around the cleanup and treatment when it comes to PFAS contamination. One has to do with providing adequate funding and continued testing for PFAS here in the state of Michigan. That's really important to ensure that we know where PFAS contamination is, and that way it can be addressed properly. And then the other is holding polluters accountable for contamination. Currently, municipalities and taxpayers have really been fronting the bill, unfortunately, when it comes to cleanup. So we need to ensure that the polluters who are actually the ones putting these toxic chemicals into our environment are the ones that are paying for cleanup. That's also something that's really important to get into the minds of candidates, is knowing that, hey, this is a problem. This is one of the steps that we can take to remediating it, is holding people accountable when they do emit these toxic chemicals. So those are all of the talking points. So we can stop there and open it up and see if folks have questions about anything specific around any of the talking points, or about like meetings in general.
Before that, let me jump in for a second. I know that this seems like a lot, and it is, and it's not even close to the information we're actually giving to the candidates. We're going to have fact sheets. We've got a website that's under construction for them to go to, which will stay up, post-election. Do not worry if you don't know everything. At least, and we don't know everything either, but at least one of us, if not, a couple of us will be on every one of these meetings. If there are questions, we will be able to jump in and answer. We don't expect you to really, lead this, but we want you to be part of it. So, but don't be nervous about anything you don't know. You can always say, that's not something I know, can you one of you answer? And if there's something we don't know, we will tell them, we will get them the answer. So, so questions? Well, one of the things, if we were to meet in person, is we would be splitting off into, pairs and doing sort of a practice of an introduction of yourself. And so we wanted to try to do that here on this, if anybody's willing. Just, you don't have to go through the whole spiel, but just do a quick, 1 minute, hi, my name is, here's my background, here's just a practice of, and maybe just pick 1 or 2 points that you want to say you want to talk about. Is anybody willing to take a stab at it? I only see a few faces. Deborah, you're the first one in my screen. Do you want to take it?
I'll do it, sure. Somebody's got to do it. So do you want to be the candidate, and are you going to be the type of candidate who just kind of goes for it?
Sure, I'll just be a candidate and say, sure. Hi, my name is Alexis, and I'm running for the 2nd district in Michigan, and I, really wanted to run because I just saw everything that was going on out, in the world. I want to make sure my kids get educated, and I've seen funding go down. I want our roads fixed. That's, those are my priorities. So, what can I do for you? Why did you want to talk to me?
Well, hi, Alexis. Nice to meet you. I'm so happy that you're running because I feel like those of us in the community really respect people who are willing to take a stand and run for office when they feel strongly about making change. I'm a very concerned psychotherapist and filmmaker in the community, and I have a lot of concerns myself about the environment and the impact on our health. Do you have any issues that are interesting to you that you're running on?
Well, I mean, like I said, education I think is really critical. I have a kid and I want to make sure that he has access to quality education. But then also, my other top issue these days is the roads. I know obviously we're not driving on them as much right now, but they haven't improved. And I'm running to make sure that those roads get fixed and education is put back in the hands of our local communities.
Wow, that's impressive. And education is such an important issue for almost all of us. We were kids at one point ourselves, and everybody in our community has young people in their lives that they are also looking out for as well. It's so concerning to see how some of the buildings are aging so quickly, and sometimes they're not tested in a way that will reflect what we're concerned about. For instance, there's so much PFAS in the water and lead in the systems that it'd be nice to know that we're getting ahead of this instead of reacting to problems. I don't know where I could go from there.
No, that's great. And I'm not trying to do everything right now. No, that's great. And, I gave you sort of a hard one because I said I wanted to, work on the roads. But,
Yeah, and then I pivoted back to schools because I didn't really know what to do with roads. But I know that is a big issue, and there's a lot of different ways that can be brought in.
Yeah.
So,
well, if somebody's priority, and this is just a general, all of this stuff is nonpartisan, obviously, but you're going to have to steer some people for sure. If we're talking to, chances are if they're saying the roads are their priority, then they're a relatively conservative Republican. You are probably from a Democrat more likely. You'll still hear education, but I wanted local community control. So, just sort of gauging, and before any meeting, we'll give you whatever background information we have on them. We don't have as much as candidates as we do when they're a legislator, but we will share with you their website so you can see their priorities. One of the candidates that I'm going to meet with, because it's a highly competitive race, has put on his commercials that fixing the roads are his #1 issue, and defeating any kind of, public transportation is, #1. So, since I work on transit so much and have, we're not going to see eye to eye on that. So I'm probably going to just avoid that topic. But so you did a nice pivot back to the lead and the PFAS, and you have to sort of gauge a little bit about where they're going to be receptive, and and we'll help with that. You're going to get farther with Republicans on lead and PFAS, and then on the energy issues, where you're going to get farther with them is on the distributed generation or the rooftop solar. And, sort of, it's that freedom to, generate your own energy. It's that ability to control your own destiny. It's that, you're not going to probably get as far with them on some of the equity issues. However, you might on some of the utility shutoff issues in the middle of COVID, and sort of when you make the connection to education because of the distance learning that's happening, especially if you're dealing with a more rural area, good access to, electricity and internet is, critical and, more iffy. So, that's sort of gauging. When you're talking to some of the more liberal candidates, you're going to get a lot more, people are going to be a lot more receptive on the equity issues. And there's still going to be you're probably going to get a lot of questions on PFAS from them as well, but a lot more willingness to regulate. Especially on the food packaging issue, you're going to get definitely more receptive candidates on the Democratic side. So it's, while we're meeting with, it's all nonpartisan, you still want to try and gauge a little bit about, sort of where their priorities are and how you can move our talking points into something that fits with their worldview. So you did great. Does anyone else want to take a stab at it? Or Mara, you were going to jump in?
I was just going to say we've had a couple of questions come through.
Sure.
If we wanted to kind of address some of those before we take any more practice interviews. Yeah. So first one is, Alexis, can you kind of explain the whole plan when it comes to meeting scheduling and when meetings will be taking place?
Sure. I'm trying to schedule really all of the Oakland County ones pretty quickly over the next 2 weeks. I'm trying to schedule most of, I guess anything that could potentially be a swing district, I'm trying to schedule as soon as possible. Anything that's pretty much a done deal, I'm trying to schedule later. If they don't have to worry and they know they're already elected post-primary, then they can meet later in October. And we'll probably still have some meetings post-election because we're not going to get through everybody we want to. I'm going to schedule as much as I possibly can, and then we will share the schedule with all of you. And so it's, and I'll share the candidate's website and whatever bio information. And then just if you can respond to me or to Mara, if it's something that you are able to join, that would be great. But if it turns out that suddenly, you know, there's something on a calendar that you see and you haven't responded, but you can join, don't feel like you shouldn't jump in, join anyway. But we're not going to try and coordinate around everybody just because it's impossible. I am going to look at what districts you're all in, and at least, you know, if it's your district, I'm going to try and coordinate that with you, but otherwise, you know, just jump in wherever you can.
Another question, because Alexis, you kind of touched on the fact that a lot of these candidates can be talkers. Do you have any tactics when it comes to trying to get their attention back on the issues?
It depends on what kind of talker they are. If they're a talker who never stops to take a breath, it gets really hard. I think in some ways it's easier to jump in on the Zoom meetings. But really, I think the best thing is you just want to try to pivot as much as possible without taking them off of what they want to talk about, unless it's just so far out there, then you have to push the pivot a little bit more. But I think because the most important thing is building, some sort of rapport, you want to be cautious about not, offending when they want to talk about something. So if you can bring it back though to something that's personal to you about it, I think it can be helpful. It just makes it more real if you can say, okay, this is really, I appreciate that that's your priority. This is really important to me and relates to this because of, my work as a nurse. And so if you can bring it back to that, that's the strategy. If they're talking and won't take a breath, I mean, just wait for the breath and try and jump in. But it's really, it's okay if you don't get to everything. If they feel like they want to talk to you that much, it's all right. Because, the more they talk, the more you know, and, we'll know more what to expect post-election if they do end up in the legislature. And we'll also probably know when, those who we really need to try to, talk to the staff to get through to. Sometimes that happens with the legislator. You really want to go through their staff. And that's going to be more critical to influencing policies than actually talking to the legislator face to face. So all of these meetings are sort of cues and as far as what it's going to look like in the future.
And then, do you have any specific techniques to practice at home prior to meetings?
Go over the talking points and try to come up with a little bit of a story about why it's important to you or how it relates to your work. I'm a nurse and I'm a pediatric nurse and I deal with kids who, are now, stuck at home. They have asthma. Okay, here's the health and safety one. I deal with kids who have, constant asthma exacerbations, are in and out of the hospital and the doctor's office. This health and safety fund is really critical because it not only will help, alleviate energy bills, but it will also improve the conditions in the home, reducing asthma exacerbations because it'll improve the air quality in the home. And so this is why I, really wanted to talk to you about these issues. And so, and that may not be your story, but anything that you can do to relate it to why, you as a health professional are engaged in these issues. You can pick, any one of the issues that we're talking about.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. And I think another really important way to frame it is to look back on the media training techniques that we talked about, oh geez, when was that? Back in June. And even probably using a lot of the same storytelling or information that you were using to frame your narrative then for this. It's pretty much the same thing. Like they'll want to hear the same type of information and really understand, you know, why it's something that you care about. Personalizing the issue for them is going to be really important because a lot of them, this is their first time hearing about these things, or if they're familiar with it, they don't probably know how it's related to health and what the connections are there. So really giving them an example is going to be helpful.
I think another thing, just, and this is somewhat off topic, but I just thought about it. If you're living in one place and suppose you're living in Ann Arbor now, but you were born in somewhere west of Grand Rapids and stuff. If you're talking to, and this goes to sort of who you're talking to, it's good to make sure you bring up those connections. If you're talking to a more rural area candidate, then if you can make that connection to a more rural area, that's good. Because sometimes you will not be as well received if you say, oh, I live in Ann Arbor or whatever. So if you can make the connection to something else. Also, and this goes to the talking, if you're meeting with somebody who's a candidate in your district, it sometimes happens that you find out that you went to school with their daughter, niece, brother, whatever. That's okay. You can go off track and have a conversation about that because it just helps the personal connection. So if you find something there where there's some weird connection that you didn't know about, always great to talk about, or about some store you went to or some bakery. I think Mara, you used to talk about a bakery with Liberati. So anything where you can find those connections, it's okay to talk about even if you go off topic.
Yeah, and then one other thing, I mean, you can have the talking points in front of you. I mean, even when we meet with legislators in person or candidates in person, we always have, kind of materials for them. And then we also have our own like talking points in front of us in case, you want to make sure that there's something specific you cover. So I think that's also important to remember too, is like it's not something where it's just going to be you and your screen and you have to have all the information in your head. You can always use your talking points as a reference as well.
Absolutely. Good point. Thank you, Mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then Alexis, another question came through is how many fellows can be in a meeting? I don't think we've really talked about this already.
When we're doing in person, we probably don't want more than, I think usually 4 people would be the max. Sorry, dog. 4 people would generally be a max because it's just, hard to fill in, get that much space at a Starbucks. We're not under those constraints right now. So I think as many as can join, it's fine to join. You probably won't all, talk a lot, but we'll just do a quick round of introductions if there's a lot of us on, but I think it's okay. So like I said, I don't want to discourage anyone from jumping in if they end up having a free hour, but if you do know that you're going to join, it's good to let us know just so we can make sure that we give you a little bit of time. But we don't want to discourage anyone from joining any of these. Zoom has allowed us to have big meetings.
Yeah, and it's nice because there's no travel time. So yes. It kind of gives you the opportunity to meet with folks who live in other parts of the state that you might not necessarily have the opportunity to meet with otherwise. Does anyone else have any questions? Those were all the questions that were in the chat box. Also, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask questions that way too.
So if we have like 4 or 5 people in a meeting with a candidate, do we take some time up front to sort of divide and conquer so that we're not tripping over each other or talking over a section that someone else is really more interested in talking over or something like that to just make sure that everything gets covered but nothing is repetitive?
If we have that many in a meeting, I think not, I mean, I think I can guarantee that not everything's going to get covered. If I know in advance that we're going to have a meeting that has a lot of people, then I will, send something that says, hey, what topic or what are you most interested in talking about? And then Mara or I, or Becca, depending on who's there, will try to help steer it a little bit toward those topic areas. But again, a lot of the lead is going to be, what the candidate, starts off saying about why they're there. Now, we may have some where the candidates, I've warned you about candidates who want to talk. Every now and then you will run into one who doesn't. And so, who just sort of, clams up and says, yeah, what do you want to talk to me about? And with those, then we just jump in and take the opportunity to talk about everything. If they're not going to, you want to give them time to respond, but sometimes you will get somebody who just doesn't. And, then we'll jump in. But I will do my best if people respond saying, yes, I'm planning on meeting this meeting, I'm doing some planning beforehand so that everybody gets a little bit in. Any other questions?
Oh, we had one that just came through. How do you handle when a talking point is questioned? For instance, if registration fees for electric vehicles were decreased, how will people that are driving them pay their share toward road improvements?
Yeah, and there
Great question.
There is a broad fact sheet, which, we'll share with everybody, all the fact sheets that we're handing out, which has some of these answers. We don't expect you to answer all that. That's where we jump in. But the answer is that registration fees really are based on cost of vehicle before they add in the hybrid and EV. And because hybrids and EVs are actually higher cost to begin with, they're actually paying more in registration fees at the outset, even before they add in these fees. Additionally, what has been shown, and there's some research, and that's what I'll share in the fact sheet, is that, sort of the higher mileage rated non-EVs, there's actually been less on gas tax from them than just a standard hybrid. Basically, it's not that we don't think that they should pay their fair share on the registration fees. It's just what has happened is because of the way it's tied to the gas tax, if the gas tax goes up in order to, say, pay for roads, you're going to end up with essentially a $500 registration fee for any kind of EV or hybrid, even though it actually is already, and that's on top of the regular registration, even though it's already paying a higher registration because of its price point. And what's going to happen then is, especially in the second generation, so somebody buys a used EV, whereas the price point might have been, high at the beginning, and so somebody bought an EV and then they turn it in and are going to buy another car, and then it ends up in the secondary used car market. Basically, people will not buy them because of those upfront $500 registration fees, which means that, means less adoption of them, and then, makes it harder to move the transportation sector toward electrification, which will reduce carbon emissions. I can also just warn, and this goes to sort of the partisan, nonpartisan thing. We talk about energy, and this is more related to the energy issues than it is the other issues. We talk about energy and climate when we're talking generally to Democrats. When we're talking to Republicans, we almost never use the word climate. We'll use energy, and we can advocate for the same policies. But climate tends to be, at least at this point in the political world a pretty hard sell when talking to a lot of people. That's just one of those knowing your audience things again. And it's hard because, and when we get into legislation, we certainly talk about climate, and, there are some executive orders around climate, and, there's going to be stuff happening at the administrative level. And right now the administration absolutely talks about climate. But it's just when, especially when trying to build a relationship with the candidate, you probably want to keep it a little bit to a minimum, depending on who you're talking to. So
Any other questions?
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to see if there were any other questions, but go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about it in terms of the electrification. So, electrification, will help solve the climate issue because of emissions from, combustion engines and all that, and from fossil fuels. But when you're talking, say, to a Republican about it, it's a question of fairness, is that they're paying more than their fair share right now. And so it's not that we don't want EVs and hybrids to pay registration fees. We just want them to pay their fair share and not more. So one is fairness, with some audiences it'll be about fairness, and another it will be about climate and emissions.
Any other questions before we wrap up for today?
And if you have other questions about it, like I said, you should start getting calendar things sent to you probably within the next week. But if you have specific questions, you can always email me or Mara, and we will respond.
Yeah. Yep. And like Alexis mentioned earlier, we are putting together some web pages with content for candidates running for office. We'll share those around with all of you as well. That's always a kind of like something great where if you're feeling a little stuck by a question, you can always reference that because those are kind of like the main points that we want all the candidates to know. I'm going to drop in our email addresses into the chat box. I'm pretty sure lots of you know how to get in touch with us, but just in case, email's probably the easiest and fastest way these days. And then just reminders, I will be sending out the link from this meeting later today, along with, right now we have the lead and PFAS candidate guides up on our site, so I can share around those links as well. The climate and energy one is currently in draft form, so it should be up probably within the next week, I would say. Wouldn't you say, Alexis?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And I'll also just kind of make a quick little plug, quick reminder that we do have a webinar scheduled for tomorrow at noon. We'll be joined by Catherine Savoy here in our office to provide an overview of the air monitoring work that they're doing in Detroit and putting it into the context of the importance of using air monitoring to improve air quality and what this all means currently within the context of COVID. But with that, if there are any other questions, thanks so much for joining us today, everybody, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you, and sorry about the dog and the toddler.
Well, actually, I think it's like great that that happened, Alexis. That's also something that's probably going to be taking place during meetings with candidates. Since everyone's working from home, I have meetings all the time where people's pets are making appearances and kids, and you just kind of roll with it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
All right, cool. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.